advisory firm, and so we were hired by the school district to look at some financial planning. So with you, you have a document, and we also have the presentation online as well, and so we will kind of dig into this. So again, as I mentioned, Jay Staley, Baker Tilly on our K-12 team. So prior to joining Baker Tilly about 2.5 years ago, I spent 26 years in public ed serving as a teacher, a building administrator, and then eventually a district level administrator. So that's kind of the lens in which we present a lot of the information. So maybe have a little more of a educational flair than perhaps than just a typical financial advisor lens, I guess. So with that, within the agenda, if you want to go ahead and advance a couple slides, or the next slide to the agenda, looking at a few pieces that we have here, I like to look at things in the kind of the 4 buckets, and we try to answer those questions, from a financial planning perspective of where have we been, where are we going, and how do we get there. And so as we look at those, using hindsight, kind of that rear view mirror lens to see what we where we have been, foresight, kind of that windshield look of where are we headed, insights, kind of what information can we glean from this data that's available to us, and then lastly is oversight, which is certainly where the board comes in and helping to drive that direction is where you want to go. And then we can start developing that plan of kind of how do we get there. And so that's I guess a little bit of the background as far as where we are. So from a hindsight perspective, if you want to go ahead and advance a couple slides, we'll move to the next one there from DUAB fiscal indicators. So I believe all of you have been on the board since at least January, so you have seen the DUAB fiscal indicators. So DUAB stands for the Distressed Unit Appeals Board. And so there is a website out on the state agency's web that will show all of this information for all the schools for the state of Indiana. So in January of this year, you would have received calendar year or fiscal year information from budget year 2022. And so that happened in January of 24. So it's certainly lagging data. So you were closing your 23 year and you're getting information on 2022. And so these are the indicators that are listed out on the website, as I'd mentioned. And then if you'll go one more slide, we have the additional fiscal indicators that we like to look at as well, just looking at what's going on with your net assessed value, what's happening with tax rate, and then also circuit breaker losses. And so if you go out and just look at all this information, the question becomes, what's it mean? I mean, there's a wealth of information. And so on the next slide, we attempted to put this into some type of an assessment with just a little quick rubric. So if I'm the layperson and I look at this, what's it tell me about the school district? And so the stoplights there on page 8, so down at the bottom. So if things are in solid, good condition, it's green. If it's kind of like the engine light on your car pops on and we need to pop the hood and take a look and see what's going on, we flagged it as yellow, and if it's a concern, we had red. And so again, 2022 data would have been the information that you heard in January. So 23, you're kind of getting a sneak peek of the information you should receive this upcoming January, in January of 25 when you receive that information. And so it's kind of polar opposites. You have lots of green and a couple reds and not much things in the middle. And so I don't think there's anything on here that's a shock to any of you. I mean, ADM, the enrollment, is certainly the concern. As we look at revenue by type, if students' enrollment issue is a concern, then that drives dollars to the education fund, and then circuit breaker losses, dollars that you're not collecting in your tax levy. So that's kind of the side that's the negative aspect. But then you have a lot of green on here. Yeah, excuse me, go ahead.
This chart, 2022 is the data from
20, it would have been calendar year, it would have been budget year 22. So it's reflective of the 22 data.
This assessment sheet for the 2023 column, that's our actual data.
So the 23 is the information from calendar year 23. The school district will just be presenting this as part of the Board of Finance to you in January as far as that data. So you're kind of getting a quote-unquote sneak peek at what that information will look like. And so then as far as the green, so certainly the district has done well knowing you have those challenges as far as managing fund balances, surplus deficit, looking at those fund balances as far as a percentage of your revenue. And so those kudos to all of you for the management aspect of that. So you've certainly made some tough decisions. So if we'll move on, so we'll kind of look at some of the inside pieces. Excuse me. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Number 5 there, revenue by type.
Sure. Yeah. So whenever you look at the state website, there's going to be, it looks like a lasagna chart, and it just has all the different layers of revenue that's been coming in and how they've changed over time from year over year. And so because your enrollment has been declining, you're receiving less revenue into your education fund. And then you're getting to that tipping point kind of within your operations levy as well. So whenever your operations levy grows by 4%, but you continue to lose dollars because of circuit breaker, then it's less money coming in. So it's just looking at that revenue on a individual level by fund. Okay, so as we move on to the insights, and we'll go to the enrollment on slide 10. So just a snapshot from the DOE. So this is just looking at historical information from an enrollment perspective from 2026 through school year 23-24. And this is looking at fall counts. So that would have been the 23 fall count for 2024. And so certainly we've been in this kind of downward trend. It's kind of been up and down the last few years after you bottomed out at around 2018 timeline. But the question is kind of what's the details that are kind of driving that. We have that on the next couple of slides. So if we can advance to the next one. So as we look a little deeper into enrollment, so the left side is looking at what's going on with legal and settlement as well as residential enrollment. And so starting in 2017, as more and more school choice has come about, the state started producing a report so that we could look at what's happening at a more detailed level. The legal settlement is the kind of the green bar in that left chart there, or the blue color. And so you can see legal settlement, it just means students that live within the boundaries of your school district that could attend school here. And then the red is the actual students that are attending school here. And so you can see that it's been kind of flat or continuing to drop a bit within legal settlement. It could be an aging population. They're just people are living here. They're not moving out. It could be families are having fewer students. It could be you're not having a lot of young families moving into the district. So, or a combination of all could be driving that particular information. And then when you look at residential enrollment, again, that's continuing to decline as well. And so that's one of the headwinds that you have facing the district, or a couple of the headwinds, I guess, facing the district is lack of additional students moving in, and then those that are here continuing to lose a greater number of those to different school choices. Then when we look at the right side from that school choice perspective on student transfers, the green bar kind of down at the bottom is looking at transfers coming in. And so as you can see, you kind of peaked in 2019 with transfers into the district, and then so you have students that are electing to stay in their home district or elect another district. And then you have additional, the growth in students that are electing another school district is that yellow bar, so the transfers out. And then as we look at the trend line as far as what's happening, we've gone from being a net loss of 184 to being a net loss of 1,055 over that period of time. And so certainly that's what's driving some of the enrollment aspect and the enrollment challenges. Any questions on the legal settlement or the transfer piece? Yeah, you are not in a unique position. Yeah, the trend is the same. So we have a lot of school districts that are losing, especially in rural school districts that are losing enrollment. That's a very good question. So one of the questions we often get is, so where are all these students going, or where are they coming from? And so that's what's captured on the next page is that list. So on the left-hand side of the list is the schools that students are transferring to, and on the right side is where they're coming from and the number of students. And so we just tried to consolidate those into where they're going. And so public charters are receiving the lion's share. So 484 of those schools, so the students are going there. 421 are electing another public traditional school, and then non-pubs 223. And so certainly there's an online component as well. And so that could be an online at a charter, or it could also be an online at another traditional school. So as you look at that list and you're like, okay, how come Union School District is here? It's way on the other side, the east side of the state. So it's most likely somebody that's taken advantage of an online academy that Union School District offers.
So as far as I can recall, the DOE website that has all this data, transfers are only reported back to the spring of 21. Yet you show a trend back to 2017. Can you share where you guys find that data versus the public website?
We took it from the public website, but we had saved the data, so I don't know if they're cycling through it, but they have it available. Yeah.
I don't think that's correct. I mean, the enrollment data you can find all the way back to 2006, which I think you reported. The transfer data that I knew of only went back to 21.
Yeah,
so,
and I can share with you.
We can talk afterwards.
Sure.
But I'm just curious as to how.
Yeah, I can share the file with you if you want it.
Yeah.
So then as we move on looking at expenditures, so we talked a little bit about enrollment. So the next piece is on the next couple of slides looking at expenditures out the door. And so as we look at the last couple of years, so 21, 22, and 23, down at the bottom, you'll see the numbers 100s, 200s, 300s. Those are referencing object code, so part of the accounting structure. So whenever you look at an accounting code, you'll have fund number, program number, and then object code. So the object code 100s is referencing salaries, the 200s is benefits, 300s is kind of professional development, 400 utilities, which obviously in the education fund we don't have a lot of that. 500s in the education fund may be for travel, so if you have travel between buildings that you're reimbursing people for, there may be a few other items in there as well. 600 is more the supply line type items. So as you look at this, certainly everything is to the left of this slide. So education fund is all people. I mean, it is truly people. It is salaries and benefits is what comes out of this this particular fund. And so from 22 to 23, the actual spend out of the education fund was down about 1.4%. So kind of back to the original statement earlier, as far as fewer dollars coming in, there's also fewer dollars going out. So certainly managing that fund from a fiscal perspective as well. And then as we look at the operations fund on the next slide, it looks a little more balanced. And so you see more spend coming out of various pieces. So for those that are around before 2019 when the funds changed, so in 2018 we had what was referred to as the general fund. And so this certainly looks more like the general fund, where you had a mix of salary and benefits, but you also had all the other costs of utilities and equipment and some of those other items as well. And so the big driver within the increase, so you saw a 10.9% increase from 22 to 23. Salaries were up, and then you can kind of see the bar chart to reference where those other areas may have gone up or gone down. All right, so if we move to the next piece, so we kind of get into some peer comparison data. So as I worked with Mr. Yancey, he had identified a handful of schools that he thought compared with you based on your enrollment, and then certainly pulled in Monroe County just because of proximity. And so you can see where on the left side, your state aid, and this is as of the 22-23 school year, where it compared with those peers versus, and then also on the right side is looking at your tax levy and your operations fund. So this is the net levy, so it's after circuit breaker has been taken into account. So you can see where you're getting your dollars per student compared to the other school within those peer groups. And then if you'll advance one more slide, so as we pull those together, you're kind of in the middle of that pack cumulatively on both. So between those state aid and your net operations levy, you're kind of in the middle of that particular peer group. And if there's other peers you would like to compare to, certainly we can take a look. You're just unique in your size, giving a rural school. There's not a lot of schools around you that are of similar size without kind of moving geography or within another part of the state, I guess what I'm trying to say. Excuse me. All right. Yeah.
Within our competitive range of our net assessed value.
Yeah.
Is that for these? Did you look at that as a comparison?
We didn't look at net assessed value within that group, but it's something we can take a peek at, or we could pull a peer group based on that. The thing we get into with net assessed value, especially when you start looking on a per student basis based on is do you use residential number? Do you use students actually attending? Because if you're one of those, if I'm receiving an additional 1,000 students that are transferring in, that's going to drive my net assessed value down, even though technically their parents aren't paying taxes in the area I live because they're transfer students. So it's kind of figuring out how to best utilize those on a per student basis, not on a total. So the next one is looking at per pupil expenditures, and so you were at the lower tier as far as spending of dollars on a per student basis. So you're just a little shy of $9,500 on a per student basis, and this is just looking at the Ed and Ops Fund. In, again, 2022. Next slide is looking at teacher FTE, so full-time equivalent for teachers. And so we went back to the 18-19 school year. This is as reported by the school, so it's coming off the collective bargaining report that's out on Gateway. And so the top number there with the orange bar is the number of students. The teal bar down at the bottom is the number of teachers. So as we divide those and we get the FTE, you can kind of see you've hovered in that 13-14 range during that period of time, up and down a bit as enrollment has changed and as you've adjusted with staff accordingly. Then when we get to the right side of the screen, so where are you in that same peer comparison group? And you're kind of in the middle. It's interesting, it's kind of that break point. Those that are in that 13 range, then we jump up to more of the 16 range. And so just as a reference for a marker, we just said, so where would you be in order to get to that 16 range? What's that look like from a staffing component? And so if you reduced your certified staff by 50 people, that puts you, 50 positions, I guess I should say, that would take you to that roughly that 16 number and be in comparison with where those other peers are. It's not saying you should. Certainly it's looking at programming. It didn't take into account how number of buildings everyone has or whatever programs that people may offer, but just simply looking at the number of teachers first and the number of students to be able to get to that number. The next slide, if we can move there, is kind of looking at the teacher compensation and benefits. So this is as of the year 22-23 school year. So the state has just finished collecting the 23-24 data, and so we're working to pull that as soon as we can get that information. So the average teacher salary across the state average is about $58,000. The district is at about $48,000 as of the 22-23 school year. Several things go into that, one being certainly the tenure of the staff. If you have a staff that has more experience, you're probably going to be at the upper end of that, versus a younger staff, you're going to be at the lower end of those numbers. Then you can see the board's contribution or the district's contribution towards single health care compared to the state average, and corporation family health care compared to the state average. And then the district is compliant with the $40,000 minimum salary. That's again, so you're on that, and I believe it's even higher for the 23-24, but you were compliant as of the 22-23 school year. Then when we look at so 62%, so the General Assembly changed the guidelines in which we now have to spend 62% of education fund on salaries and benefits for your teaching staff. So at the end of 22-23, before this went into effect, so at this point in time, there was a different guidance that you had regarding 45% for just salary. You would have been trailing that 62% number. And so you can see where you were at 59.8 compared to that 62% number. And so we'll work with Mr. Yancey as well as the business office to see where you are from a compliance standpoint, if you were able to hit that number at the end of this school year, and if not, whatever steps would need to be taken in order to be compliant as you move forward. And so the next slide kind of looks at where you fell within those other peer comparison groups. And so you can see that a couple of them also fell short as of that 22-23 school year. So it'll be interesting to see how many were able to. And then as you see, the outlier there is Monroe County. And so one thing to keep in mind is they do have an operating referendum, so they have additional dollars that they're able to utilize, which helps them to be able to push additional dollars from their educational fund into those salaries.
You had us with a green light on referendums on opening radio.
Yeah.
My knowledge, we don't have any referendums.
Correct. That's why I had a green light. It was the fact you just didn't have anything to report. So we typically will put it as yellow if you have one, just because it's temporary funding. I mean, so at 8 years, it's going to run out unless the public decides to renew it. All right, so looking at the next slide, just kind of a setup for the next one as far as 2019 funds compared to 2018 funds. So I met with the board here recently, and all of their board members had taken their seats after 2019, and so they had no concept of the transfer from ed to ops and why we do this and we shouldn't do this. And so it's just kind of just a reminder for those who were on the board and for those that weren't, kind of what this is all about. And so prior to 2019, you see the funds that were on the left-hand side. So we had this general fund and then these other funds that were listed there. In 2019, the general fund went away and we had an education fund. The revenue that went into the general fund now goes into the education fund. Capital projects, transportation, and bus replacement were all collapsed and put into the operations fund. So within that old general fund, which I made a statement earlier, there were operational costs for maintenance, for custodial team members, for salaries and equipment and supplies that was all in the general fund. Well, that got moved to the operations. And so the state said, hey, even though the expenditures are going to the operations fund, the revenue that was supporting those is still going to go into this education fund. So you're going to need to make a transfer. So whether that's monthly, quarterly, annually, however you want to schedule that, you'll need to make that transfer. They later came and said, hey, that cap's 15%. That's the most you can transfer without being on the state naughty list is 15%. And so that's kind of where that threshold has been and remained. And so that sets it up kind of a little bit for the next slide. So if you'll click to the next. So this is where you were at the end of 2022 in comparison to those peers. And so whenever we talk, as you talked about circuit breaker, as I talked about circuit breaker losses, school districts that face circuit breaker loss, dollars are not collecting their operations levy, have a tendency to have to transfer more money to their education, or to their operations fund out of education, because their operations fund isn't whole from a levy perspective or from a dollar perspective. And so we see that trend going up for those particular school districts. But you can kind of see where those are. Whereas on the opposite end of the scale, if you're at DeKalb, minimal circuit breaker issues, and so they're not having to transfer as much dollars from education to operations. And then as we look at your operating fund cash balance, kind of back to, we had mentioned your fund balance as being green, so you're currently setting, or you were at the end of 2022, 54.5% in cash balance. This is in your operating funds, and so operating is defined by S&P as from a rating agency looking at your education operations and rainy day. If you had an operating referendum, they would include that there as well. And so rule of thumb minimum for government is 5% cash balance. S&P kind of would give you when you go through the rating process, would give you a feather in your cap if you had 15%. They're recently changing that or going through a process of changing that to where they're going to ratchet that number to 30%, but you're still well above that number as far as where you're currently sitting. And then if you'll advance the slide one more, kind of look at where you've been historically. So the education fund balance you can see has grown over the past couple years. Operation grew as well, and then took a little slight dip last year, and then we had an increase overall and cumulatively between all of those and adding in rainy day. The numbers continued to increase over the last couple of years. So you've been able to put money away and have a strong cash balance. Next slide. So as we look at tax rate, you can see where your tax rate falls within that peer group. So you're just under $1, and this was the 2024 tax rates. And then as we can look at the state average for 24 was $1.05, a little over $1.05. So you're, trailing that state average. All right, so the next slide is just kind of a reflection piece, and so if Mr. Yancey, and if you want to have some thoughts or discussion or conversation, we just threw that in to be able to kind of spur that conversation. So unless there's any questions on that front, we'll keep moving. All right, so next section is kind of looking at foresight. So kind of seeing where we've been, so where are we headed to? And so as we look at some budget challenges that are coming up ahead, certainly there's always something within education that feels like that are challenges. The funding formula this year is about 1.7%, so it's much less than it was last year. So assuming enrollment stays flat, that's kind of the dollars that you have on the table. But as I've been speaking with other districts, they're losing more students, and that 1.7% isn't even going to be on the table. So it's going to be a matter of a fewer dollars to be able to support things. So that's certainly going to be a challenge. Life after ESSER funds have dried up, or will be drying up at the back half of this year. So if you spend it on one-time purchases, then it's certainly dollars won't be available for future use. And then if you had positions or programming that you had to do or that you did with that money, then deciding if you're going to bring those back in-house or if you're just going to let those expire. Enrollment challenges we talked about. Special populations funding is another big one that as we're talking with schools across the state, just the additional growth in special ed. ELL population has been growing across the state as well, and so just the additional services that are needed to be able to support those. NAV growth, this is one to keep an eye on. So when I checked this morning, Lawrence County had not released your net assessed value yet for 2025. But does your growth, is it greater than the maximum levy growth quotient? So your growth quotient is 4%, so that's where it's capped across the state. So your levy in your operations fund for next year is going to go up 4%. If your assessed value doesn't go up 4%, it's going to raise the tax rate within your operations fund to support it. So depending on how tax rate sensitive the board or the community is, just something to be aware of. And so we've seen NAV so far come in the threes up to 16%. So it's kind of been all across the board. Some of the double digits have been surprising, and it feels like it's being driven by communities that have a lot of farmland. So farmland assessments have been up. Those that are more residential have seen a little less growth than perhaps some others. If you want to go ahead and move on to the next slide. So whether it was from my time being an athletic director or surviving 2 teenage daughters learning how to drive, I always have kept an eye kind of to the weather piece. And so I think the forecasting with hurricanes kind of mirrors what's going on with finance. So you have this whole cone of uncertainty. The further you get out, the more variability there is. And then as we start looking at those spaghetti noodles that are on the right side, whenever you change an input, it's going to change an output. So if the weather gets warmer, if the wind blows in a different direction or wind speed, whatever it may be, it's going to change what happens. So the same thing with financial forecasting. So if you'll go to the next slide, we kind of look at the schedule of assumptions. So this is kind of the details that spit out the model that we'll go through a few of the highlights of. And so just a couple of things was enrollment. So we worked with Mr. Yancey to get, I think you guys do your own projections internally, so he was able to feed us those ADM projections. We used net assessed value based upon, we work with a group called Policy Analytics, and so they are the ones that provide us the tax-based analysis. So then they also help drive that maximum levy growth quotient as far as what the projections could be as you move forward. within that levy projection for your operations. The funding formula historically for the last 10 years has grown about 2% on average, and so that was the number we used in the funding formula. Some years is more, like last year. Some years it's less, like this year, and so that's kind of been the average number. So if we change one of those numbers, certainly it's going to change an output. And so the biggest thing is just kind of where does it look like we're heading, and if it's a direction we don't want to go, how do we make some course corrections so that we're able to not go there. So if you can advance one more slide. So as we worked again with policy analytics, where do they see your net assessed value? And so they were projecting a pretty moderate or growth of only, I guess, 2 or 3.5%. And so as we think back prior to some of these big spikes that we've seen over the last 3 years, it's probably where we have been historically. It's kind of where they think it may go. But again, as I mentioned earlier, we're seeing farm assessed value. So depending on that breakdown of how, especially farm assessed value comes in, that number could certainly go up. But that's kind of where they see is at 3.5% over the next couple of years. If you go to the next slide, so what's that mean from a tax rate perspective? And so you can see the top line is the total, the orange line is the operations rate, and then the debt service rate is the yellow rate. And so debt service, I know you've been in the process of either you have issued bonds or we're going to issue bonds, and so that may be impacted a bit from where that one is. We haven't updated that since we spoke with Mr. Yancey last on that the bond calculation. But as you can see, the total rate, so as the debt rate, should it drop, the total rate would also decrease. But you can see the operations rate stays relatively flat. You see a little bit of an uptick as you get further out, and it kind of goes back to what I mentioned earlier. They were projecting your maximum levy growth quotient being less than the net assessed value. So because of that, it would force your tax rate up slightly within that operations fund. And if you can move to the next is circuit breaker impact. And so this is looking cumulatively at all of your circuit breaker losses. And so the lion's share of losses typically fall within that 1%, 2%, 3% cap number. But we do have some circuit breaker for the 65 and older that can also hit your debt fund or your pension fund. So cumulatively, projecting you at that 13% and kind of continuing to tick up a little bit as you go. So again, just something to keep in mind that those are going to be less dollars coming into your operations fund in particular. Next slide is looking at your education fund, and so we have historical information 21, 22, and 23. So the the blue bar is the dollars in, the gold bar is the dollars out, and then the kind of that maroon bar is the difference, so deficit or surplus. And so you've ran a surplus the last 3 years. We were projecting a surplus again in 2024, but then projecting that as dollars continue to get a little tighter and as expenses go up, that trend could reverse and you could become into a deficit situation. And then if we look at the next slide is the operations fund. And so again, the prior 2 years 2 years, 21 and 22, you ran a surplus. 23, you would run a slight deficit within the operations fund, even though within your operating funds in total, there was a surplus. And then again, we're showing that at some point in time, and it's a little further out down the road, is when the operations fund starts to get into a little bit of a hurt. So question becomes, if we know that the operations fund may have this positive cash balance, do we not transfer as much from education to operation? Do we ratchet that down a little bit to try to balance it? So that is one budget lever that you would be able to utilize if you so chose to do so. And if you can advance one more slide. So then cumulatively, what's this look like between education and operations? So again, we're still showing an operating surplus until we get out to about 2027 and timeline. So good thing about timeline is that you have time, and you also have cash to be able to make some decisions. It's just it allows you to kind of control your own destiny. So unfortunately, I work with schools that we're having this conversation in the summer and they're going to be negative at the end of the year, and so it doesn't give you a lot of time to make decisions, and you certainly have to make ones that might be a little more drastic than if you are able to have a little timeline to be able to change those. And the next slide was looking at debt, and then certainly, again, it doesn't take into account the bonds that you're in the process of selling, but just knowing that as you have those cliffs that are falling off from 24 to 25, if you're looking to either manage your debt rate, your debt levy, whatever it may be, just planning that out into the future. All right, so the next piece, unless there's any questions.
How would it be for you to run, so you assume the 5.45% decrease in enrollment year over year in your scheduled pensions.
Yep.
So
Sure, we can do that.
a listing of different, scenarios.
Yeah. We can do that.
We did see steep declination the last 3 years, but taking that as somewhat of an anomaly and looking at really the last, say, 06 to 19.
Right.
I think you're a little better representative of what the average would be from here on out. So, and I don't know that it's, I don't know exactly what it,
Okay.
I know what it is by errors, but, anyway.
Okay, yeah.
Take a look.
Absolutely. And as we mentioned, that's certainly going to change a big piece within the education fund, right? If you're not losing 5%.
Do you know, Mr. Yancey, what this year's numbers are shaping up to be?
Yes.
And can you give us any hint, or you want to talk about that exact?
Executive, but we were wrong, you and I.
Are we wrong? Okay, we'll talk more about that.
We are we're very happy.
So we were
But,
wrong too.
I have some questions for him in the operations fund. We're at the max of transfer from education to operations. With the other schools you worked with, can you give the board or I some insight of some things of how, because of inflation, how we can help bring in revenue to the operations fund?
Yeah, so, and we may dive into this a little later as well. So a couple things that we see schools do is you're able to leverage your debt fund within your operations fund. So if you look at the capital expenses, so if you look in that 700 category that's there, what are you spending out of there? Oftentimes it's buses. So that's one thing that we see people move to their debt, and then they can do a short, they can do a 1 year, what's considered or if you sold a geo bond or a master lease equipment of some kind to be able to pay those off. You don't have to do them in long term. If you're going to move them there, it has to be within a shorter period of time. Most bond attorneys will tell you 6 years is kind of where it's at. But then also looking at how can you save some energy costs, I think is another one. So everything we're hearing from energy companies, utilities is 16 to 22% increases coming. And so if that happens, again, it's just further pressure on there. So can you look at, is there some opportunities for solar, geothermal, any of those renewable energy options that may be there? There's currently some federal programming that may be able to help offset some costs. So from a return on investment perspective, it seems to make it a little more appealing at this time. So those are a couple things that we see some districts doing that might be able to help on that front. All right. Yeah.
Back to what Damien has told us, you're sitting very good. Again, you have about $80 million worth of debt to keep your tax rate the same because North pays off its debt extremely fast. We're at the cap at 40, you can go above 40 cents. I just got done doing the budget, so I got the numbers. So we're right at debt services about 39 cents. And that's where I've been told that means we pay off our debt very quickly here. So as you know, the debt we put on since I've been superintendent, that's going to be paid off relatively quickly. The neat thing is we can fix things now. We can get our schools more efficient. And we're going to have plans to give to the board shortly in the next 6 months of showing how we can be more efficient with our funds, especially operations. And, but we're sitting in a great place to make some changes that we won't have to do severe changes in, like he said, like some of the schools are having drastic issues. We're sitting where we can do it gradually and we can plan. We have 2 or 3 years to plan what we need to do. So it's a great issue to be in, really. So
What about the cash balances? And this has always baffled me a little bit because you just made a reference to basically corporations, publicly traded corporations, SP 500, 5 to 15%, and yet we're sitting at 58% or something like that, and all the other schools that you compare us to are sitting around maybe 1 or 2 or a little lower. So what's the real right answer there as far as cash balances?
Yeah,
Because you
that's
obviously need some
a
buffer
great
there.
question. First, I would say that it depends, right? It's like everything else. There's nuances to every school district. I'd say the first thing is what's going on within your district. So what's happening with enrollment, what's happening with your circuit breaker. And so those are 2 red flags that I would say because of that, I may want a little more in my back pocket as far as to being able to navigate to give myself some time. But it's certainly, I don't want to be a bank either. So if my buildings are in disrepair, if we're not able to offer programming or we're not able to pay people to retain them, then it's certainly kind of trying to find that balance of where that sweet spot might lie. So with that, I think that 30% number that the S&P is kind of saying this is where we think is a good number to be seems like a pretty good spot. I would feel comfortable there if it was me, if that's where my cash balance got to. Is kind of that number. Across the state, it's 35%. It's kind of that state average as far as where buildings are. No, it wasn't. Yeah, so that's kind of where it is across the state from a state average perspective. And I've worked with a couple districts this summer that are 110. I mean, they could literally survive if they got no funding next year. And I've worked with one that has 2%, and so they're at the opposite end of that. And so it just kind of depends on where you would like to be.
In our rainy day fund, I was told that we'd like to be between about 3 months to be able to support ourselves if we went in a massive recession. 3 to 4 months, that would need about $8 million. We are not at that level. So you'll see in the budget that we'll have a discussion. I'm moving $500,000 into the rainy day fund I'm going to propose. That a lot was done by the interest of investments of CDs we've done. So I'm trying to raise that fund to get us a little bit of cushion. So if we go into a recession, that I do believe is probably going to happen sometime in our future, we will be prepared to be able to pay people if the state stops funding us for a short period of time. In the past, in the old days, we used to have to go to banks and get loans to pay our people when the state wouldn't pay the ADM. Remember back in the old days when I was in school, it was paid on property tax. Today, half of our payment is paid by the state of Indiana. They took over the education fund. We have to be prepared, I think, but I do believe the board took a very good move, spending the $2.4 million in salaries the last 2 years. And I think we have to continue to look how we invest in our people, because the data does show that you're about $10,000 off of the average. And when we take a look at area schools around us that we pull teachers from, I know we can't compete with Monroe County because the referendums, as you can see, they're massive. But we need to invest again in our people. And how are we going to do that? There's only 2 ways to do it. Either increase your revenue by kids, or you decrease your expenses.
Right.
And I think we're going to have to do a both approach.
But if, I don't know what percentage of the cash balance that the rainy day fund makes up, but
Well,
if you're going to increase it or propose to increase it by 500K, and that bumps our cash balance up to a higher percentage than
It does.
54.5, then that seems to be going in the opposite direction, if we would rather push that money out to our people, so.
We can push out some other funds if we can keep our level of
Yeah.
enrollment.
I don't know how much we have to worry about the threat of the recession and not having funds to pay our people,
Well,
I mean,
That's a great.
okay,
But
it just depends on how conservative we want to be there.
I think we're in a setting in a good position. If the numbers hold out, the next year we can invest in our people again, and then look to see what we need to do in the operations. And we have some plans that we've worked out with people that you'll get for the next 6 months to see what we want to do possibly in January to offset inflation in the education front. One of those, I will tell you tonight, is Maverick. Maverick is a consortium of schools for natural gas. I want to go to this consortium because it stops and spikes. So if you set in a price of your natural gas price, so if natural gas would have inflation and go up, you get that price. So I have numbers to show you. If we would have been in Maverick over the last 5 years, we would have saved about $100-some thousand. In education, every little bit you save, there's no magic bullet to save a bunch of money. But I also have some other plans I want to show you that we could possibly invest in to bring operation costs down, because if he says inflation in utilities is going to be 16%, we're all in trouble. Let's be honest, you'll pay your electric bills. Can you imagine what that's going to do? And when the state is only giving us a 2% increase, that's not even counteracting inflation. So we have to be very prudent on how we forecast to be conservative, because inflation can kill us. If we don't, it's an enemy to our school, because we have to decrease our expenses because of inflation. We've already done, the board has, with general obligation bonds, you've already bought buses through general, we haven't gotten buses yet. They were ordered a year ago. I'm afraid we might have the buses paid for before we get them. Because, but we have already done some things. He's made a comment that we worked with, and I've got some more questions to ask him in private, of some ideas, people, to see what his opinion is. But we are in decent shape.
So, kind of back to what Adam was saying with if we move that money over, I mean, I understand why we need to be conservative, but I think because everything is based on enrollment, if we do invest in the teachers and our staff, I think that will also help with enrollment. So, I want to be conservative, but I also don't want to be so conservative that we don't do the things that we need to do to keep good teachers, to recruit good teachers.
You have about a $10,000 expense for each person, I think, to be competitive.
Mhm.
That's a lot of money at one time for
Yeah.
a corporation, because as you look at our ratio to student ratio, we're still low. So that has to, we've been dealing with this over the last year that I've been here, so we continue to do our plan, follow some ideas that he has. I think the district can be in pretty good shape in the next 2 or 3 years if we keep on rolling.
And that's where I think the transfer report and data is so important, because we saw a spike in our transfers out. Let's say we get back and project that to be somewhere in the competitive range of our peer districts. What would our enrollment be at that point? Knowing that we're in a region, county that's generally declining population, that becomes, let's get that to where, sensitivity analysis is kind of what it is
Yeah.
where would it be if we got this many students here?
And the neat thing about the rainy day fund, the appropriations, the board has the right by law to spend $2.5 million out of that account anytime you want to. So even though we moved 500,000 that mostly came from investments, the board can easily move any amount of money up to 2.5 million. That's what I appropriated out of that fund. The rainy day fund is not at $2.5 million. That's what you can expend by law. It's about $6 million. So we have set ourselves up for a good 3 months of paying if we do not get any support from the state. That's where we need to be with other districts, in my opinion. But I did leave in the appropriation, the board has the right by law to move $2.5 million by a vote. So and we've been doing that previously here at North Lawrence, so I went ahead and did to give the board that option. So if we think we can do, you were in negotiations, hopefully we can invest in our people, like you and I spoke
Yeah.
about before.
But if we did what Wendy just talked about, said, all right, let's project what higher teacher pay and more satisfied workforce would do for our.
Oh, it would help.
enrollment, and kind of, if there's an appreciable limit as to how many we're gonna.
It's kind of like, dealing with the root cause. The declining population is one thing, but then what are the things that we can do to, and I think that, investing in our people, the people who are with the students, whether it's a teacher, a coach, an aide, but we want to do so prudently, right? We don't want to get in a situation where we can't pay people, but that is just something to think about as we consider all of this.
Luckily, we have time to make good decisions in the next year to project where we would be, so that's a good news. I'll be honest, I've seen the report a month ago, and I'm pretty happy. And I've got to see the numbers that we'll talk about, and I'm pretty happy. But, I'm not going to take the thunder away from our new director, but when she comes up and we now have 174 or 178 people in Playful Pathways, when you had 41 before I came, that's a huge increase of debt that we were accumulating, over $1 million. So now we've erased that pretty much. And you're not making money, but we're not here to make money in school. We're here to pay for our bills, and that's a huge cost that's now been diverted because we've now got people in that building. That's not in the population. I didn't count that. If we
No, it
count
shouldn't
that-
be.
No.
Yeah.
But it already our accountant that helps me write the budget, since Robin's not with us anymore, he picked it up. He said, "What's happened here?" He said, "You're gaining revenue. Where did you get it from?" That's Playful Pathways. Almost $300,000 that we didn't have because we were eating money up in this endeavor that wasn't ran like a business. And you have to run things like a business to keep them out of the red. And she was going to talk about it tonight, so I just stole
Well,
the
that's
thunder.
Good.
But she's done it, all of them done the last 3 months, a great job.
watching on
Yeah, she's, we on TV?
Yeah, we
Oh, that's great. But we're very happy that those numbers went up.
Yeah, I think going back to the sensitivity analysis, give us a 1, give us a 2, give us a 3. If you project those now, and then we see that we're following the, say, 2%,
Right.
then we'll say, all right, this is about the curve that we would be on.
Makes sense. We can do that.
And,
Okay.
and also, I mean, how that impacts, the state mandate of 62% for salaries and benefits, between enrollment and the rainy day, and trying to bridge that 10K gap. At what point do we maybe break even on that?
Sure.
I want to
As a
wrote the
goal.
budget for losing 50 kids because I'm using our, so I went ahead and wrote it. Yeah, no, we're not right, so, okay. But that's a good news.
Yeah.
Yeah, but at least we were conservative, and you were right on the numbers over the past, so we've had it's great. We have a huge, I don't know where the kindergarten kids came from. There's no data that we should have had a spike in kindergarten. I mean, we have really did a great job at little ones, and I don't think we've had a baby.
Take full credit for it.
I didn't think we had a baby boom. Got 2 more coming. All right. Keep having them. No.
All right, great conversation. We'll hustle through these last couple slides. If you want to move on to the SWOT, I'm not going to dive into this. It's kind of a summary of things that have talked about. The one thing I will mention on the threat side is many of those things you can't control. They're kind of out of your control. So as you had mentioned earlier, what can we do to help enrollment? But as far as economic uncertainty, legislative actions, things that may come up, unfunded mandates, curricular material things that came about last year. So those are things that are kind of out of your control. So just how do you able to react with those? The one strength that I haven't talked about that I will mention is that your pension debt is paying off at the end of 2025. So pension has been a tax neutrality piece, and so you have to decrease your operations levy in order to get those dollars. So you'll have a little more dollars going into your operations fund because of that payoff. From an oversight perspective, so we put this together and asked Kevin and Robin before she had left to kind of go through the self-assessment piece. And so just looking at some best practices, and certainly we could list 6, 12, 15 other things on here, but it was just kind of hey, where are you at from a district perspective on some best management pieces? And so if you've started it, if you haven't started it, if you're fully implemented, so we scored it, and then kind of what we asked them to identify what are some barriers. There's just a lack of a tactical plan. It's just not on our radar. We don't have the time, the tools, the training, whatever that may be. And so the next piece is kind of that. If you'll go one more slide for me, the kind of where those things fell. And so tracking enrollment trends was something certainly you're doing internally. We did the tax-based changes as part of this process through policy analytics. Projecting staff needs, that was something that it felt like they were started but not fully implemented. Program inventory assessments, and so where are dollars being spent? And so not only dollars but time. So as you think of things as a plate, if we're just going to keep adding more things to the plate, at some point it's going to break or things are going to fall off. And so how are we looking at how we're spending dollars and where they're going, and should we repurpose them and not do some things? And so that may be an area that you might want to consider digging into a little further. Monthly cash flow projections, and so I know we're kind of in that transition piece, and so if there's anything we can do to assist on those cash flows, we're happy to do that. The 3 to 5 year financial projection, again, this is a work in progress, so we're working on that front. The capital plan, kind of that Mr. Yancey was referencing, and so do you have that capital asset plan tied to your debt management plan or even tied to your operations plan? What's coming out of operations? What's coming out of debt? As you look at debt, is it short-term debt versus long-term debt? So just trying to identify how you can leverage the dollars that you have. And then just how do you want to manage things from a cash management, debt management, fund transfers? Do you have some policies and procedures in place from that? An energy management plan. So do you want to look at some type of renewable energy pieces to help contain some things? Mr. Yancey's reference as far as Maverick Energy, I will tell you, we were part of the consortium where I was at, and it saved us a lot of money as well. So it's a direction I would encourage you to go as far as looking at those ways to save those dollars. Maybe one of the biggest pieces is your strategic plan, how that aligns to your academic indicators as well as your finances. And so if you say, hey, we have a really focus on trying to support early literacy. So as we look at the budget, do we have money in the budget that supports early literacy? Are we funding those programs? So are those things aligned to be able to get what we're looking for? And then if you'll go to the next slide, some considerations we put on there just for next steps. So compliance, salary, and benefits, where were you? And then how do we look to close that gap if you weren't there? Looking at those fiscal management best practices and kind of which ones to implement. And then lastly, just looking at your 2024 year to date. And so we had the projection of where we thought you were going to be, but where are you year to date? And so that's something we don't have the information for, and something we're happy to take a peek at and help with. But so where does it fall? So are you with projection? You behind projection? What does that look like?
So,
Yeah.
so the DUAB or the
Yeah.
stress unit is a lagging, extremely lagging.
It is a lagging indicator.
But
Yes.
Are not the Form 9s and the budget forms for at least a year past, aren't those available where you could get that same data?
So we can only get Form 9 as of 2023, so that you just closed the last 6 months, and we won't be able to have access to it. So it's something we have to get from the school district itself.
Well, right. And we
Yeah,
have
but
that,
yeah, right,
but
yeah.
it'd be a little closer than the 2-year
right,
lag. Of
yeah.
the-
So and again, we have some schools that send us stuff monthly, and so we'll produce the cash flow. We put together this little quarterly dashboard just to show kind of trends and where you've been, and so it makes for a nice. And that's something.
So as a function of our ability to get you the data, you could.
Yeah,
format
absolutely,
it.
right. So that way it's so you're able to track it along. Happy to take any questions. I know that was a lot of information. I talked really fast at the end, but again, I think to echo what Mr. Yancey had said, you're in a nice spot. I mean, certainly you have challenges to overcome. You have some cash, you have some time. If enrollment is up, that's a great thing. That'll even buy a little more time as well, but happy to help and answer whatever we can.
Well, just if we talk about a potential 50-person law, if we had thought maybe the declination of enrollment might be 50 and we were wrong to the good, that would have been a 1.4%, and you used 5.4%. So you were really negative in your
Right.
assessment. So we'll see what it is here. I know the official count's not until September, but hopefully Mr. Yancey will share that with
Yeah.
us. And
Yeah, and we'll run those at those different points so you can kind of see where
Please,
you're
yeah.
trajecting along there.
All
So
right, thank you.
yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
All right, so any other discussion among board members from our work session? All right, then we can, I think we'll take a break. We'll go ahead and end the work session, and in 8 minutes we'll come back and do our regular meeting.